Clara Whitmore pressed her bleeding hands against her apron and told herself she would not cry. Not again. Not in front of him. Walter Grimes had taken everything. Her husband's land, her name, her dignity. And now he owned the hours of her life, from before sunrise to long past dark. She was 34 years old, and she had nowhere left on this earth to go. The stew she stirred smelled like the home she used to have. She didn't know a stranger was about to taste it, and refused to leave without her. If you enjoy stories about women who survive the impossible and find love on their own terms, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart before it heals it. The trading post sat at the edge of the world. Or at least that was how it felt in the deep of a Montana winter, when the snow came sideways and the wind had a voice that sounded almost human. Not like a person calling for help, but like something older and crueler, reminding you that you were small and alone, and one wrong step from disappearing entirely. The kind of cold that didn't just bite at your skin, but worked its way into your bones and sat there, patient and permanent, as if it planned to stay forever. Ethan Callahan had lived in that cold for 7 years. He rode into the settlement of Harrow Creek on a gray horse with no name, wearing a coat that had been repaired so many times. The original fabric was barely there anymore, just patches sewn over patches, every one of them a small record of a winter survived. He was 37 years old. He had the hands of a man who had never stopped working, and the eyes of a man who had stopped expecting much from the working. He didn't come to Harrow Creek for company. He came because his salt was almost gone, and he needed ammunition before the next storm moved in, and the next storm was already visible on the horizon if you knew how to read the sky, which Ethan did. He tied his horse at the post outside Walter Grimes's trading post and pushed through the door without looking up. The bell above the door rang once. Nobody greeted him. That was fine. Ethan didn't want to be greeted. He moved through the cramped space with the deliberate economy of a man accustomed to knowing exactly what he needed and exactly where to find it. Salt, percussion caps, a coil of wire for repairing his rabbit traps. He set each item on the counter without speaking and waited for Walter Grimes to appear from behind the curtain that separated the front of the store from whatever lay behind it. Walter came out wiping his hands on a cloth that did nothing to clean them. He was a wide man, heavy in the middle, with a red face that looked permanently irritated, as if the world had spent years failing to meet his expectations, and he had decided to hold that against everyone he met. He looked at Ethan's items and named a price that was roughly twice what the items were worth. Ethan didn't argue. He had dealt with Walter Grimes before. He counted out the money, set it on the counter, and was about to turn and leave when the smell stopped him. It came from behind the curtain. It was venison stew, from the smell of it. Slow-cooked, seasoned with something he couldn't immediately identify. Rich and deep in a way that cut straight through the cold air of the trading post and reached some part of him he hadn't thought about in a very long time. Not years. Longer than that. Ethan stood very still. Walter looked at him with mild suspicion. "Something wrong?" "That smell," Ethan said. His voice was rough from disuse. He didn't speak much, and when he did, the words came out like they'd had to fight their way out. "What is that?" "Supper," Walter said, and his tone made it clear the conversation was over. But Ethan didn't move. "You selling it?" Walter's expression shifted into something calculatingly friendly. The way a man's face changes when he realizes there might be money in a situation he hadn't anticipated. "Bowl'll cost you extra." "Fine." I didn't know why he said it. He hadn't planned to sit down. He hadn't eaten in nearly a day, which was not unusual for him, and he had dried meat in his saddlebag that would have served the purpose well enough. But something about that smell had reached into him and closed a fist around something he couldn't name, and before he could reason himself out of it, he was sitting at the small rough table by the window with a bowl of stew in front of him and a spoon in his hand. He took one bite, and then he sat very still for a long moment. He had eaten in mining camps and army forts and lonely cabins, and once in a proper restaurant in Helena, where the tablecloths were white and the forks had more prongs than seemed necessary. He had eaten food cooked by his mother in a farmhouse in Missouri when he was 8 years old, before everything changed. He had eaten food cooked by his wife in a small house in Colorado before that ended too. This stew tasted like something between those two memories. It tasted like someone had cared about it. That was the only way he could put it to himself, sitting there with the wind rattling the window and Walter watching him from across the counter. Somebody had cared about this food, had thought about it, had paid attention to it, had wanted the person eating it to feel something more than just full. Ethan set his spoon down. He looked at Walter Grimes. "Who made this?" he asked. Walter's eyes did something complicated. A quick sideways movement, like he was calculating something. Then he leaned his elbows on the counter and smiled in a way that wasn't friendly at all. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'm asking." Walter seemed to decide the answer couldn't hurt anything. "Woman in the back, widow, name's Whitmore, Clara Whitmore." He said the name the way you might say a type of furniture, something useful, something you owned. "Came through here about 4 months back with her husband. He got sick, died quick, left her with nothing but debt." Walter shrugged. "I covered his funeral expenses, and his tab, and the room they were using. She works it off." Ethan looked at Walter for a moment without speaking. "Works it off how long?" "Till it's paid." "How long is that?" Walter smiled again. "That depends on the math." Ethan understood the math immediately. It was the kind of math that never came out even, the kind that added interest you hadn't agreed to, and subtracted wages you were owed, and always, somehow, left the person working owing more at the end of the month than they had at the beginning. He had seen that math before. He had seen it done to people who had no way to fight it. He picked up his spoon and finished his stew without another word. But he didn't leave. He sat at that table for a long time after the bowl was empty, staring at the window while Walter moved around behind the counter muttering to himself about inventory. The wind outside had gotten louder. The temperature had dropped another few degrees in the time since Ethan had come in from the cold. He could feel it through the wall. "How much does she owe?" Ethan asked finally. Walter looked up. "That's not your business." "I'm making it my business." Something shifted in Walter's expression. He straightened up to his full height, which was not insignificant, and looked at Ethan the way men look at each other when they're deciding whether a situation is going to require a different kind of conversation. Then he seemed to remember that Ethan Callahan was not a man you wanted to have that different kind of conversation with, not if you valued the condition of your face, and he settled back down. $40, Walter said. Ethan looked at him steadily. "What does she actually owe?" "Funeral costs, room, food." "What was the husband's tab? Tell me the real number." Walter's jaw tightened. "I just told you. You told me a number that works for you," Ethan said. "I want the number that's true." There was a long pause. The fire in the corner crackled. Outside, the wind howled, and something loose on the roof banged rhythmically in the gusts. Walter said, very carefully, $14. Ethan nodded once. He reached into his coat and counted out $14 and set the money on the counter. "Then she's paid." Walter stared at the money. His face had gone through several different expressions in quick succession and arrived at something that was part fury and part calculation. "You can't just—" "The debt's paid," Ethan said. "That's how debt works." "She's got nowhere to go," Walter said, and there was something almost triumphant in his voice when he said it, as if her lack of options was a card he'd been holding and was now choosing to play. "It's 30 below out there tonight. You pay off her debt, she still walks out of here with nothing. No money, no family, no horse." He spread his hands. "She's better off here than dead on the road." Ethan was quiet for a moment. I thought about the stew. He thought about what it tasted like, that specific quality of care in it, the attention someone had put into seasoning and timing and getting it right. He thought about what kind of person cooked like that, and what it meant that a person who cooked like that was living in a back room, working off a debt that kept growing no matter how hard she worked. He walked to the curtain. "Ma'am," he said. There was silence from the other side. "My name's Ethan Callahan. I live up on the North Slope, about 6 miles up through the pass. I just paid your debt to this man." A pause. I ain't looking for anything in return, but it's 30 below tonight and it's going to be worse tomorrow. I've got a cabin that's warm and there's firewood enough to last the winter. Another pause. You don't have to come with me. You don't have to do anything at all. But I wanted you to know the debt is paid and the choice is yours. The curtain didn't move. Ethan waited. Walter made a sound behind him that might have been a laugh. Then the curtain moved. Clara Whitmore was not what Ethan had been expecting. He could not have said exactly what he had been expecting, but it wasn't this. A woman who was probably 34, maybe 35, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke to months of poor sleep, and hands that were red and roughened from work, and a dress that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever color it originally was to a pale gray-brown that matched the color of exhaustion. She was not tall. She stood with her shoulders slightly forward in the particular way of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. But her eyes were not exhausted. They were dark and direct, and they looked at Ethan with an assessment that was careful and unhurried, as if she had long since learned that the speed with which you trusted a person was directly proportional to how much that trust could cost you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Ethan said. She glanced past him at Walter, who was watching from behind the counter with his arms crossed and his expression sour. Then she looked back at Ethan. "Men who want nothing don't pay other men's debts," she said. "This man's debt wasn't honest," Ethan said. "Paying it off didn't do him any favors, and I ain't expecting any from you." Then why? It was a fair question. Ethan had been asking himself the same thing since he'd put the money on the counter, and the honest answer was complicated enough that he didn't entirely understand it himself. Something about the stew. Something about the look Walter had gotten on his face when he said her name. Something about 30 below, and a woman with nowhere to go, and the particular way it felt to know you were about to walk away from something you couldn't fix. "Because the stew was the best thing I've eaten in 7 years, he said. "And I didn't like what it told me about how the person who made it was being treated." Clara looked at him for another long moment. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yes." "For how long?" 7 years. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Same reason you ended up in the back room of a trading post, probably. Life went in a direction I didn't expect." Something shifted in her expression at that. Not much. A very small change around the eyes that might have been recognition. "Your cabin," she said. "How big is it?" "2 rooms, small loft. It's warm." "You said I could leave when I wanted to." "Spring," he said. "Roads open up in April. You'd have your share of whatever we earn over the winter, hunting, trapping, whatever else. Enough to get you somewhere you want to be." He paused. "I'm not promising anything comfortable. Mountain winter is hard. But it's not as hard as what you're doing now." Clara turned and looked back through the curtain at the small space where she'd been living for 4 months. There wasn't much to see. A narrow cot, a small chest, a hook on the wall where a coat hung, the sum total of what her life had been reduced to. She turned back around. "I have one condition," she said. Ethan waited. "I'm not your servant," she said. "I'll cook and I'll work and I'll do my share. But I ain't taking orders. I ain't asking permission. And if you raise your hand to me for any reason—" She stopped. Her chin came up. "I'll leave. I'll walk out into that snow and take my chances." Ethan held her gaze. "I've never hit a woman in my life," he said. "And I don't give orders. I make agreements." "Then make me one. I'll provide shelter, protection, and supplies. You cook, mend, and share the work. Come spring, you go wherever you want with your share of what we earn. Equal split on everything." He paused. "That's the agreement." Clara looked at him for one more moment. Then she walked back through the curtain, picked up the small chest and the coat from the hook, came back out, and walked past Ethan toward the front door without looking at Walter Grimes at all. Ethan followed. Walter said something behind them, something sharp and insulted about ungrateful women and the cost of charity, but neither of them stopped walking. Outside, the cold hit like a wall. Clara stopped 2 steps beyond the door and stood very still while it hit her, her breath coming out in white clouds, her eyes straight ahead on the narrow road that wound north out of Harrow Creek and into the dark tree line of the mountain. Ethan came to stand beside her. He untied his horse and held the reins. "It's 6 miles," he said. "Some of it's steep. We'll need to walk the last 2. Clara nodded. "You can ride most of the flat part," he said. She nodded again. He gave her a hand up onto the horse without making anything of it, handed her the chest to hold in front of her, and then took the reins and started walking. They didn't speak for a long time. The settlement fell away behind them, and the trees closed in, and the wind got louder but less sharp once they were out of the open, and the snow was deep on the trail, but Ethan knew every step of it, every frozen creek crossing, and every place where the ice was thick enough to trust, and every place where it wasn't. He heard Clara's breathing behind him, steady and controlled. She didn't complain. She didn't ask how much farther. She just rode and held her chest and kept her eyes forward. After about a mile, she said, "What happened to you 7 years ago?" He walked a few steps before he answered. "Lost my wife," he said. "Fever. February. We'd only been in the mountains 2 years. He kept his eyes on the trail. After that, it didn't seem like there was much reason to be anywhere in particular. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't always matter," she said. He glanced back at her. She was looking at the trees, her expression unreadable. "No," he agreed. "I reckon it doesn't." They walked on. The cabin came into view after another hour, dark against the snow, low-roofed and solid, built into the hillside in a way that made it look like it had grown there rather than been constructed. Ethan had built it himself in the first winter, and then added to it in the second, and by the third it was as close to permanent as anything got in the mountains. He unlocked the door and held it open. Clara stepped inside. She stood in the center of the main room and looked around at the rough walls, the stone fireplace, the narrow shelves of supplies, the single table with its 2 chairs, the coats and tools and equipment hung on every available surface, with the dense practicality of a man who had organized his whole life around survival. Then she set her chest down on the table, took off her coat, and hung it on the nearest hook. She turned to face the cold fireplace. "You have wood?" she asked. "Stacked by the wall outside," he said. She rolled up her sleeves. "Then let's start a fire," she said. And that was that. Ethan brought in wood without being asked twice, and Clara built the fire with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it her whole life, and within 20 minutes the cabin was warm enough that you could feel the cold retreating to the edges, and Clara had found his salt pork and the last of his dried beans, and had a pot on before Ethan had even finished seeing to the horse. He came back inside and stopped in the doorway. The fire was going. The pot was on. There was steam rising. The cabin smelled like something it hadn't smelled like in 7 years. Like someone lived in it. He didn't say anything about it. He just pulled off his boots and sat down in the chair by the fire, and Clara moved around the small space with a purposefulness that was somehow both efficient and quiet, not disturbing anything, not asking where things were, just finding them. And Ethan watched her and felt something strange and uncomfortable moving somewhere in the vicinity of his chest. Not longing, exactly. Not yet. Something more preliminary than that. Something that felt like the memory of a door he had locked a very long time ago, and the distant, unsettling sense that someone had just knocked on it. He looked away. He stared into the fire. He told himself this was a practical arrangement. A winter arrangement. She needed somewhere to be, and he needed someone to help with the work. And come spring she would leave, and he would go back to being alone, which was what he knew, and what he trusted, and what had never, in 7 years, let him down. Clara set a tin plate on the table in front of him without announcement, and sat down across from him with her own. He looked down at the food. Salt pork and beans. Simple. Nothing remarkable. He looked up at her. "It ain't the stew," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I didn't have what I needed to make the stew." "It's fine," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'll make the stew when I have what I need." It was the first time he saw something in her expression that wasn't guarded or careful or braced for disappointment. Just a small, quiet certainty. like a woman who had decided that whatever had come before this moment, she was still capable of making something worth eating, and that mattered, and she was not going to apologize for knowing it. Ethan Callahan picked up his fork. He didn't say anything, but for the first time in 7 years, he was glad he hadn't eaten before he came in from the cold. They ate in silence, the fire cracking between them, the wind moving around the outside of the cabin like something that wanted in and couldn't find the way. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward 20 below, toward 30, toward the kind of cold that kills careless men and makes careful ones grateful for walls and fire and wood and whatever else keeps the worst of it at bay. Inside, the cabin was warm, and Ethan Callahan, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, did not eat alone. Walter Grimes watched them go from the window of his trading post, his breath fogging the cold glass, his fists tight at his sides. He had let $40 walk out his door. No, not 40, 14. He said it again in his head, and the number made him angrier the second time. $14, a month of her labor. Easy. More, if he stretched the accounting, which he had been doing, and which he had intended to keep doing until spring, or until she broke, whichever came first. He watched the big man walk north up the trail with his horse and the woman on it, until the trees swallowed them up and there was nothing left to watch. Then he turned away from the window and went behind the counter and poured himself a whiskey and stood there drinking it and thinking about $14 and thinking about the North Slope and thinking about Clara Whitmore's hands. Not with any warmth, but with the specific cold calculation of a man who had discovered that something he thought he owned had been taken from him, and who was already working out what he might be able to do about that. He poured another whiskey. He could be patient. He knew where the cabin was, and spring was a long way off. The morning after was the first test. Ethan woke before dawn the way he always did, by instinct rather than habit, the particular quality of the darkness telling him it was time. He lay still for a moment, listening to the cabin settle around him, the fire down to coals, the wind still working at the walls. Then he heard something he had not heard in 7 years. Someone else breathing. Clara was asleep in the loft, quiet and still, and the sound of her being there was so foreign and so strange that Ethan lay on his cot for a full minute, just registering it. Another person in the cabin, another heartbeat in the walls. He had forgotten what that felt like, and now that he remembered it, he wasn't sure whether it was a comfort or a warning. He got up without making noise, and rebuilt the fire, and put water on for coffee, and pulled on his coat, and went outside to check the traps before the light came up. The cold was savage. Overnight it had dropped past 30 below, and the trees were cracking with it. Sudden sharp sounds in the darkness like rifle shots, the frozen wood splitting under its own tension. Ethan moved through it without much thought. This was his element. He knew what to do with cold that killed lesser men. He knew how to breathe it and walk through it and survive it. And there was a kind of freedom in that knowledge that had kept him out here 7 years when everywhere else had felt impossible. He checked 6 traps. 3 rabbits. 1 had been there since yesterday and was frozen solid, which was fine. The cold kept everything. He reset the traps and was back at the cabin before the light had fully come up. Clara was awake. She was standing at the fire with her back to the door when he came in, already dressed, her dark hair pulled back and pinned, a cloth across her shoulder. She had found the coffee. He kept it on the 3rd shelf, and she hadn't asked where it was. She had just looked until she found it. And she had it brewing, and she turned when she heard the door and looked at the rabbits in his hand without any expression of distaste. "We have salt?" she asked. "Barrel in the corner," he said. She nodded once and went back to the fire. They ate breakfast without talking much. Ethan noticed that she ate everything on her plate, which he took as a sign of a practical person rather than a delicate one, and she drank her coffee black, which he took as a sign of someone who had stopped expecting things to be pleasant and had learned to take them as they came. He didn't know if any of that meant anything. He told himself it didn't. After breakfast, he said, "I'm going to check the upper traps today. Be gone most of the morning." "All right," she said. "You'll be fine here." She looked up at him from across the table. "I was fine in a trading post in Harrow Creek for 4 months," she said, not unkindly. "I reckon I can manage a cabin." He had no answer for that, so he put on his coat and left. He was gone 4 hours. When he came back, the cabin had changed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not fully understanding what he was looking at, because the shape of the room was the same, and everything was in the same place. The shelves, the table, the coats on the hooks. But something was different. Then he understood. She had cleaned it. Not rearranged it, not moved anything out of its place, but cleaned it. The surfaces, the floor, the corners that had accumulated 7 years of solitary bachelor living. The fire had been tended. There was something on the stove that smelled the way the stew had smelled the night before at the trading post. And on the table, there was a small cloth she had found somewhere and laid flat. And that single detail, that one piece of cloth on the table for no practical reason, hit Ethan somewhere behind the sternum in a way he was not prepared for. He hung up his coat. He didn't mention any of it. "Good hunting?" Clara asked from the stove. "2 more rabbits," he said, "and a fox." "Fox is worth something at the spring market?" "It is." "Then we should keep track," she said, "of what we take in, both of us." He stopped. "You know figures?" She turned to look at him over her shoulder with an expression that said she was deciding whether to be offended. "My father ran a dry goods store in Ohio," she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 12. Yes, I know figures." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down. He was quiet for a moment. "That might be useful," he said finally. "I know," she said, and turned back to the stove. I watched her for a moment. There was an efficiency to the way she moved. Nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. That reminded him oddly of watching an expert handle a tool they knew intimately well, every motion exactly where it needed to be. She had been doing this a long time. Not just cooking, managing, making something out of not much, and keeping a careful accounting of all of it. "What happened to the store?" he asked. Her hand paused very briefly over the pot. Then she picked up the wooden spoon and resumed stirring. "My father died when I was 22. The store went to his brother, not to me. That's how it works." Her voice was matter-of-fact, the way people are matter-of-fact about old pain they've already made their peace with. "I married Henry Whitmore 2 years later. He was a good man. He just had bad luck." "The debt," Ethan said. "The debt was real," she said. "Some of it. Henry had borrowed money in good faith, from the wrong man, as it turned out. Walter Grimes doesn't lend money in good faith. He lends it the way a trap is set." She paused. "Henry got sick on the road and was gone in 3 weeks. By the time I understood what Grimes intended to do, there was nobody to help me argue against it." She looked down at the pot. "So I worked." "For 4 months," Ethan said. "For 4 months," she agreed. I thought about that for a moment. 4 months of working off a debt that wasn't real, in the back room of a trading post, with no money, no family within reach, and a Montana winter on the outside of the walls. "You could have run," he said. She looked at him then, fully, with those dark, direct eyes. "In what direction?" she said. "It was November when Henry died. There was already snow. The nearest town with a stage line was 20 miles east, and I didn't have a horse or a coat warm enough to get there." She turned back to the stove. "Running requires somewhere to run to." Ethan sat with that. I understood it completely. He had made a different version of the same calculation 7 years ago, after Sarah died, when staying on the mountain had seemed less like a choice and more like the only remaining option. When you took away all the directions a person could go, what was left wasn't freedom. It was just the remaining place. "Well," he said after a while, "you've got somewhere to run to now, if you want it." She looked at him. He meant Denver, or Helena, or wherever she wanted to go in the spring. He had been clear about that. He said it now to make sure she still knew it, that this was a season, not a sentence. Clara held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. But she said it in a way that was neither grateful nor dismissive, just quiet and inward, and he had the impression she was filing it away alongside a collection of other facts she was not yet ready to act on. The first week was an exercise in two people learning how to exist in a small space without colliding. Ethan had his rhythms, and they were deep cut. 7 years of solitary living pressed into every habit he had. He rose at the same time every morning. He ate at the same time. He came and went on a schedule so fixed it might as well have been mechanical. He didn't talk during the first hour of the day. He left his coat on the second hook from the right. Always the second hook, without thinking about it. And the one time he came in, and Clara had put something on that hook without knowing, he stood there for a moment, looking at the hook with an expression on his face that he was not aware of. Clara noticed. She moved her things to the third hook without saying anything. He noticed that she noticed, and for some reason that bothered him more than the hook had. She had her own rhythms, different from his, and she didn't ask permission for them. She rose slightly after him, but worked faster in the mornings, organizing and cooking and assessing their stores with an efficiency that would have been impressive if he'd been paying attention to it, which he was, though he wasn't ready to say so. She kept a small notebook. She'd had it in her chest, along with a stub of pencil, and every few days she would sit at the table after supper and write things in it. Quantities, figures, what they had and what they needed. A quiet record-keeping that asked nothing from him. On the 6th day, she set the notebook open on the table in front of him when he sat down after supper. He looked at it. 2 columns, one for what they'd trapped, one for estimated market value in spring. At the bottom, a running total that was already more than Ethan had expected, because he had been hunting and trapping for himself alone, and hunting for 2 changed the math. "You've got more than you think," Clara said. She sat down across from him and pointed to the column on the right. "These prices are conservative. If you go to the Helena market instead of Harrow Creek, you'll get a better rate." She paused. "Grimes has been underpaying you, probably." Ethan looked at the figures. He was not a stupid man, but this was not where his intelligence lived, in columns and calculations, and he knew it. "Helena Market," he said. "That's 2 days' ride. I know, I looked at your map." She said it without apology. "The road through the pass is better, worth the extra day." He looked up at her. "You looked at my map." "You left it on the shelf," she said. "Was I not supposed to?" He thought about it. The map had been on the open shelf, visible to anyone who walked in. He hadn't told her not to look at things. He hadn't told her much of anything, because he was not a man who gave a lot of instructions, and she was not a woman who asked for a lot of permission. And until this moment, those 2 qualities had coexisted without friction. "No," he said finally. "It's fine." She nodded. "I can write up a proper inventory if you want, something we can both track." He looked at her across the table, at the notebook, at the pencil stub she'd set neatly beside it. "Do it," he said. She pulled the notebook back and started writing. He watched her for a moment. The slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the careful script, smaller than he would have expected, and then looked away. He looked away because something was happening in the simple act of watching her that he didn't have a name for, and when he didn't have names for things, he didn't tend to look at them too long. The first argument happened on day 9. Ethan came back from the upper traps to find Clara outside the cabin, standing on the east side where the snow had packed hard against the wall, using a heavy wooden pole to knock ice from the drainage channel along the roofline. She had her coat on, and her breath was coming in hard white clouds, and she was working efficiently, but it was 25 below, and the drainage channel was 8 feet off the ground, and she was doing it wrong. Not dangerously, exactly, but in a way that would take twice as long and wouldn't clear it properly. I took the pole from her without asking. She turned and looked at him. "I can do it," she said. "You're doing it from the wrong angle," he said, and demonstrated. One firm strike at the right place on the ice dam. A chunk the size of a saddle came loose and fell to the snow. Clara looked at it. Then she looked at him. Her expression was careful. "You could have said that." "I just did," he said. "You took the pole first," she said, without asking. He lowered the pole and looked at her. She was right. He had done that. He had walked over and taken the tool out of her hands without a word, the way you would do with, well, with someone who needed correcting, which was not an attitude he had meant to have, and which he understood, now that she was pointing at it, had probably not felt like a minor thing from where she was standing. "You're right," he said. She blinked. Apparently she had been prepared for him to argue. "I'm sorry," he said. "The right angle for that ice is—" He showed her, not taking the pole back but guiding her hand, and she watched, and then he stepped back, and she did it herself, and the next chunk came down clean. She cleared 3 more sections while he watched, doing it right. Then she handed the pole back to him without looking at his face. "Thank you," she said. They went inside for coffee, and neither of them brought it up again. But something had shifted, and Ethan was aware of it in the way you are aware of a tooth that has stopped hurting, not calling attention to itself, but notable in its absence. 2 weeks in, Walter Grimes came up the mountain. Ethan heard the horse before he saw it. The particular rhythm of a horse that didn't know the trail, picking uncertain steps through the snow. He was outside splitting wood when the sound reached him, and he set down the axe and waited. Walter Grimes rode into the clearing on a brown horse that was unhappy about the weather, his red face redder than usual under his hat, his breath coming in loud clouds. He pulled up when he saw Ethan and looked down at him with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something on the way here, and was now having to decide whether to deliver the rehearsed version or adjust. He adjusted. "Callahan," he said. "Just checking on things. Making sure the widow is settling in all right." Ethan looked at him. "She's fine. Just want to hear it from her, if it's all the same." "It ain't all the same," Ethan said. "She doesn't owe you anything. You don't have business with her." Walter's jaw tightened. "I'm just being neighborly." "No," Ethan said. "You're not." Something in his voice made Walter's horse shift uneasily. Walter pulled the reins and straightened up to his full mounted height, which was an impressive thing when you were sitting on a horse and the other man was standing. "I got a legitimate interest in—" "Her debt is paid," Ethan said. "You took the money. That's the end of your legitimate interest." He paused. "You rode a long way up a cold mountain for a conversation that's already finished." Walter looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were small and calculating, and Ethan had the clear impression that there was something working behind them that was more complicated than a neighborly call, and that the working thing was not friendly and would not be finished just because Ethan had said so. "She got family?" Walter asked, casual as a man commenting on weather. "That's her business. Just making conversation." "Make it somewhere else," Ethan said. Walter's smile came back then, slow and without warmth. "You're real protective of a woman you've known 2 weeks, Callahan." He turned his horse. "Interesting." He rode back down the mountain. Ethan stood in the snow and watched him go and felt the particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature, the kind that settles in the chest when you understand that a problem has not been solved, only postponed. He went inside. Clara was at the stove and she turned when he came in, reading his expression the way a woman reads a room she has learned to be careful in. "Who was that?" "Grimes." Her face went still. "What did he want?" "Said he was checking on you." "He doesn't do anything without a reason," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "Don't worry about it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm thinking. There's a difference." She turned back to the stove. "He's not done with us." Ethan didn't say anything to contradict her, because she was right. 3 weeks in, Ethan got his first real look at who Clara Whitmore was. It happened over a rabbit. One of the traps had caught a young rabbit, and when Ethan brought it back, Clara went to skin and dress it with the brisk matter-of-factness of a woman who had grown up practical and had not allowed herself to become otherwise. He watched her work and saw that she knew what she was doing, not the rough efficiency of someone who had learned recently, but the deep unconscious fluency of someone who had been doing it their whole life. "You grew up in a dry goods store," he said. "My father sold dry goods," she said, still working. "That doesn't mean we lived like city people. We had a farm behind the store. I hunted with my brothers until I was 16, and they all left for other places." She paused. "I know how to do most things that need doing, Ethan." It was the first time she had used his name. He didn't comment on it. He just filed it somewhere. "Henry didn't grow up like that?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Henry was a good man who wanted to make a new life out west and trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. She set down the knife. That's not a crime. It's just bad luck, like I said. She looked at him. Why do you ask about Henry? Trying to understand, he said. Understand what? How you got here. How someone... He stopped. You're too capable to have ended up in a back room for 4 months. She looked at him for a long moment. Capable people end up in impossible situations all the time, she said. That's not a failure of capability. That's just how the world works, especially for women who don't have family money or family men to stand behind. She picked the knife back up. The world doesn't ask how capable you are before it decides what it's going to do to you. Ethan sat with that. He thought about Sarah, who had been one of the most capable people he had ever known, and who had died of a fever in February because there had been no doctor within 60 miles and the roads were impassable. He thought about capable meaning nothing when the conditions were wrong. No, he said. I reckon it doesn't. Clara glanced at him. Something in his face made her expression change, soften slightly around the edges. You understand that, she said. Don't you? Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to work, and he sat there, and the fire cracked between them, and it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. It was something more honest than both of those things. It was two people who had each learned that the world could break you and were watching each other to see if that knowledge was shared. It was shared. Month 2. Mid-January. And the cold had gone past anything Ethan would describe even to himself as normal. They were spending more time inside, which meant they were spending more time in close proximity, which meant they were learning things about each other that there was no way to avoid learning when you ate at the same table and sat by the same fire, and the nearest other human being was 6 miles down a frozen mountain. He learned that she had nightmares. Not every night, maybe once a week. He would hear her from the loft, not screaming, just a sharp, sudden sound, and then silence, and then the particular kind of quiet that is a person lying very still and awake. He never said anything about it. He didn't know what he would say. He just lay in the dark and listened to her breathe herself back to calm, and thought about what 4 months in a back room would leave in a person's sleep. She learned that he didn't sleep past 3 in the morning. She came down the loft ladder one night. He heard her coming and didn't move, and went to the fire and sat in the chair beside it and stared at the coals for a while. He watched her through half-closed eyes. She didn't know he was awake. She just sat there in the firelight with her knees drawn up and her chin resting on them, looking at something he couldn't see, and after a while her face did something he hadn't seen it do before. It went completely unguarded. All the careful control she kept in place during the day, all the precise management of what she showed him and what she kept back. It fell away for just a few minutes while she thought she was alone in the dark. And what was underneath it was not the tired competence he had been cataloging. It was just a woman who was very sad and very tired and very much trying, one day at a time, to figure out where she was going. He closed his eyes all the way before she came back to the loft. He didn't sleep for a long time. The second major argument happened on day 38. A man named Doyle came up the mountain, a fur trapper, half wild, who had been working the same territory for years and who considered any other trapper within a 5-mile radius an encroachment. Ethan had dealt with Doyle before. It wasn't warm between them. Doyle came to the cabin while Ethan was checking the river traps, and Ethan came back to find Clara standing in the open doorway of the cabin and Doyle on his horse in the clearing, and the quality of the space between them was extremely clear even from 50 yards away. Ethan walked faster. Doyle was saying something in a low voice that Ethan couldn't hear until he was closer, and when he heard it, his jaw went tight. It was the kind of thing a certain kind of man says to a woman when he's decided she must be available because she's living in a man's cabin without a ring on her finger. The kind of thing delivered in a friendly tone that doesn't disguise what it is. Clara was looking at Doyle with an expression that was not afraid. It was something colder and more considered than fear. She hadn't moved from the doorway, and she wasn't going to. "Doyle," Ethan said. Doyle looked at him. Whatever he saw made him recalibrate quickly, which suggested he had enough sense to be alive this long. Callahan, just being neighborly. Like Grimes was being neighborly, Ethan said. Doyle glanced at Clara and then back at Ethan. She your wife? She's my partner, Ethan said. It was the first time he had said it out loud, and it came out without deliberation, as simply and directly as the truth of a thing. And she doesn't need to be asked twice about anything. You understand me? Doyle understood him. He left. Ethan turned to find Clara still in the doorway, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. He waited for her to say he had handled it wrong, or too aggressively, or that she could handle herself, all of which would have been valid. She said, "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but the way she said them, quietly, directly, without the guarded distance she usually kept in place, made them weigh considerably more than 2 words. Ethan nodded once and went inside. He sat down and picked up the mending he'd been doing on a broken harness and focused on it with excessive attention for several minutes, while Clara came inside and closed the door and went to the stove, and he was very careful not to look at her. He had called her his partner. He had not thought about it before he said it. It had just come out, the way the true name for a thing comes out when you stop trying to find a different word for it. He kept working on the harness. He did not think about what it meant that it had felt, in the moment of saying it, like the most accurate sentence he had spoken in 7 years. Mid-February. The nights were the worst, but the days had started getting fractionally lighter, the way they do in Montana in February, where spring is still 6 weeks away, but the light begins making promises it eventually intends to keep. Clara had found the gold. Not much. A small deposit in the creek bed under the north bank that had been covered by ice until a warm spell in early February exposed part of the bank, and she had seen the glint while fetching water. She came in with wet hands and a careful expression and set 3 small flakes on the table in front of Ethan without saying anything. He looked at them. He looked at her. "North Bank," she said. "Below the ice line. There might be more." He sat very still for a moment. 7 years he had lived on this mountain. 7 years. He had fished that creek, crossed it, used it. He had never seen gold in it. "How?" he said. "I wasn't looking for it," she said. "The ice broke funny and the bank was exposed and the light hit it right." She paused. "That's how these things work, I think. You have to not be looking." He stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the creek and then looked back at her. "Equal split," he said. His voice was firm. It was not a question. Clara looked at him. "You found the land." "You found the gold," he said. "Equal split. That was the agreement." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved across her face, something complicated and private that he didn't try to name, but that looked like a woman receiving something she had stopped believing people gave freely, receiving it and not knowing immediately what to do with it. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll need to keep it quiet," he said, sitting back down. "Can't let Grimes know." "He's already curious about us," Clara said. "Hi is," Ethan agreed. "Which means we work fast and we keep the take somewhere he can't get to it." He thought for a moment. "I know someone in Helena, a lawyer, named Adler. He handled Sarah's—" He stopped. He hadn't said Sarah's name out loud in a long time. The word sat in the air between them for a moment. "He's trustworthy. We can file a claim through him." Clara nodded. She reached out and picked up one of the gold flakes from the table and turned it in her fingers, studying it the way you study a small thing that might be the beginning of a large thing. "Ethan," she said, still looking at this flake. "Yeah. I don't want to go to Denver." He went very still. She looked up. "I know that's what we agreed. Spring, I leave, but—" She set the flake down carefully. "I don't want to start over somewhere I don't know. I don't want to find a new situation and learn a new place and trust new people." She paused. "I'm tired of starting over." Ethan looked at her. His throat felt tight in a way he hadn't experienced in a very long time. He was careful about what he said next, because he understood that what she was saying was not the same as saying she wanted to stay, and he did not want to make her feel like she was being pressed toward a decision she hadn't yet made. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said carefully. "I know. Spring is still 2 months off. I know that too, but—" He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. "You'd be welcome," he said, "to stay. If that's what you wanted. It would be— the terms would be the same. The partnership." He looked up. "Whatever you wanted it to be." Clara looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "Whatever I wanted it to be," she repeated quietly. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll think about it." And that was the most honest thing she could have said, and Ethan Callahan understood it completely, and he nodded once and looked back down at the table, and neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of that day. But that night, when the fire had burned down and the cabin had settled into its dark and cold and quiet, Ethan lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about 3 gold flakes on a table and a woman who said she didn't want to go to Denver. And he thought about Walter Grimes on a brown horse asking if she had family. And he thought about the way she had looked in the firelight when she thought she was alone. And he thought about how the cabin smelled now, and how different the silence was when it was shared. And he thought about all of it for a very long time. Outside, the mountain held its cold and its secrets, and the creek ran dark under the ice, and somewhere in the north bank there was gold that neither of them had been looking for when they found it. Just like everything else worth having in this life, the gold changed everything, and not all of it was good. They started working the creek bed in early February, in the narrow window each day when the light was strong enough and the temperature had climbed above brutal into merely punishing. Ethan built a sluice from spare lumber, and Clara designed the angle of it, drawing the measurements in her notebook with the pencil stub, and showing him what she wanted before he touched a single board. He looked at her drawing for a moment, recognized it was right, and built it exactly the way she had drawn it without modification or comment. That was its own kind of respect, and she noticed it. The work was hard and cold and exacting. They stood in the creek bed with the water moving around their boots, running gravel through the sluice, watching for color in the riffles. Clara learned fast. She had always learned fast. That was not the issue. The issue was that gold work required patience in a particular concentrated form. The kind of patience that asks you to keep doing the same careful motion over and over for hours, without knowing if the next pan would show something or nothing. Some people couldn't do it. It drove them frantic. Clara did it with the same quiet focus she brought to everything. And after the 3rd day, Ethan stopped watching her to make sure she was doing it right, and started just working beside her. They were good at this together. That was the part that unsettled him. Not that they were good at the gold work specifically, but that they seemed to be good at everything they tried together, in a way that felt less like luck and more like fit. The specific fit of 2 people whose particular strengths happened to complement each other at every point. She had the figures and the patience and the eye for detail. He had the land knowledge and the physical force and the instinct for where the mountain was likely to give something up. Together they covered ground that neither of them could have covered alone, and the take at the end of February was more than Ethan had made in an entire previous year. He told her this one night after supper while she was writing in her notebook. She looked up. "I know," she said. "You knew before I did," he said. "I've been keeping the numbers," she said simply. "How much do we have?" She turned the notebook around on the table so he could see the column on the right. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "That's not enough to retire on," Clara said. "But it's enough to file a real claim, get a proper survey done. If the deposit is as large as we think it might be—" She paused. "We need that lawyer, Adler. We need the claim filed before someone else walks this creek." Ethan looked at her. "Someone else like Grimes." "Someone else like Grimes," she agreed. He nodded slowly. "I'll go to Helena next week." "We'll go," she said. He started to say it wasn't necessary for her to make the trip, that it was 2 days down and 2 days back, and the roads were still rough. And then he looked at her face and stopped. Her chin was up slightly, and her eyes were steady, and he understood that this was not a matter of logistics. This was her claim too, and she intended to be present for the filing of it, and she was not asking his permission. "We'll go," he said. The night before they were supposed to leave for Helena, Walter Grimes came back up the mountain. This time, he didn't come alone. He had a man with him that Ethan didn't recognize. Younger than Grimes, lean and quiet, with the particular way of sitting a horse that said he had spent a long time in places where sitting a horse wrong got you killed. He wore a deputy's badge that Ethan didn't trust the moment he saw it, because the county seat was 40 miles east, and deputies from the county seat did not ride up mountain passes in late February for no reason. They came in the afternoon. Ethan was outside when they rode up, and Clara was inside, and he positioned himself between the cabin door and the two horses before they had fully pulled up, which was not a subtle thing to do and was not meant to be. "Callahan," Grimes said. His voice was friendly in a way that set Ethan's teeth together. "This is Deputy Haskell. He's got some questions." "About what?" Ethan said. Haskell looked at him with pale eyes that didn't warm up when the rest of his face moved into a professional expression. "There's been a complaint filed," he said, "about a woman, Clara Whitmore." He paused. "Mr. Grimes says she left his establishment under some pressure, that the situation wasn't fully voluntary." Ethan looked at Grimes. Grimes looked back at him with small, satisfied eyes. "That's a lie," Ethan said. "That may be," Haskell said, in the tone of a man who hasn't decided anything yet and is being paid to seem neutral. "But I need to speak with the woman herself. Make sure she's here of her own free will." The cabin door opened. Clara came out. She stood behind Ethan and slightly to his left, and she had clearly heard everything because her face was arranged in the particular careful expression she wore when she was managing something that required very precise management. She looked at Haskell directly. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm here because I chose to be here. I left Mr. Grimes's establishment willingly, after Mr. Callahan paid the debt I owed." She paused. The debt, I should mention, that Mr. Grimes had inflated from what was actually owed. The real figure was $14. He was asking $40. Haskell looked at Grimes. Grimes's face had gone red. "That's her word against mine." "It's also in writing," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. She reached into her coat and produced her notebook. Not the gold ledger, a different one, smaller, which Ethan hadn't known existed, and opened it to a page near the front. "When I first arrived at Mr. Grimes's establishment, I kept a record of everything I was told I owed and everything I was told I was earning. I've been a bookkeeper since I was 12 years old. I didn't stop being one because I was in a difficult situation." She held the notebook out to Haskell. "The numbers don't lie. He was adding charges I never agreed to, and paying me a wage we never agreed on either." Haskell took the notebook. He looked at it for a long moment. Grimes made a sound. "That's just... she could have written anything in there." "The dates line up," Clara said. "If you want to verify it, you can check his own ledger. I wrote down what he showed me, every time he showed me. If his ledger matches my record, then either we both made the same calculations incorrectly, or my record is accurate." She met Grimes's eyes. "I don't make calculation errors, Mr. Grimes. You knew that when you let me keep your storeroom inventory." The silence that followed was very loud. Haskell closed the notebook. He looked at Grimes for a moment with those pale professional eyes. Then he looked at Ethan, then at Clara. "The lady seems to be here willingly," he said. "She is," Ethan said. Haskell handed the notebook back to Clara. "I'll need to look into the debt situation," he said to Grimes, in a tone that had lost its neutrality and taken on something cooler. "You should probably ride back with me." Grimes looked at Clara with a fury that he didn't bother to disguise. It was the look of a man who has just lost something he had already decided was his, and who is filing away the loss in a specific account he intends to settle later. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is for today," Haskell said, and turned his horse. Grimes followed. Ethan and Clara stood in the clearing and watched them ride back down the mountain, and neither of them said anything until the sound of the horses was gone entirely. Then Clara let out a slow, careful breath. "You had a second notebook," Ethan said. "I've had it since November," she said. "Since the third week at the trading post. when I understood what Grimes was doing. She put it back inside her coat. Evidence doesn't help you if you don't keep it. He looked at her. He thought about her sitting in that back room with a stub of pencil, writing down every figure in her careful small script, while Walter Grimes moved around the front of the store thinking he held all the cards. "Clara," he said. You are the most—" He stopped. He was not a man who finished sentences like that easily. He looked away. "We need to leave for Helena tomorrow," he said instead. "Earlier than we planned." "Yes," she said. "We do." She went inside. He stood in the clearing for another moment, looking at the place where Grimes had been, and understanding with the specific clarity that comes from seeing a pattern complete itself that this was not over. Grimes had played one card and lost it. He had at least one more. The question was what it was. They left for Helena before dawn the next morning, loaded light and moving fast. Clara on the gray horse and Ethan walking the first stretch as he usually did to manage the horse's weight on the steep sections. They didn't talk much. The mountain required attention in the early morning dark, and they had both learned to read what the other one needed, when to talk and when silence was the practical choice. They were 3 miles down when Clara said, "He's going to try something with the claim." Ethan kept walking. "I know. If he gets to the land office before us—" "He won't," Ethan said. "Adler's already expecting me. I sent word 2 weeks ago." She looked at him from the horse. "You sent word 2 weeks ago." "I sent it with the Rogers boy when he came up to trade. Figured we'd need to move fast when the time came." He glanced back at her. "Did I step on something I should have talked to you about first?" She was quiet for a moment, and he turned to look at her properly, and what was on her face was not anger, but something more complicated. The particular expression of a person recalibrating, adjusting the picture they have of another person to accommodate new information. "No," she said. "No, you didn't." Another pause. "You've been planning ahead, for both of us." "We're partners," he said. "That's what partners do." She was quiet for a while after that. They made Helena in a day and a half, stopping one night at a way station where the keeper looked at them with the calculating eyes of a man who rented rooms and drew conclusions, and Clara looked back at him with the expression she reserved for people who needed to understand they were making an incorrect assessment, and the keeper looked away and gave them 2 rooms without further comment. Adler's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Last Chance Gulch, up a narrow staircase, and the man himself was small and precise, with a neat gray beard and the eyes of someone who had spent 40 years reading documents for what they concealed as much as what they said. He had handled Sarah's estate, and Ethan trusted him the way you trust someone who has dealt with you honestly at the worst moment of your life. He shook Ethan's hand and then Clara's, and when she sat down, she opened her notebook on his desk without being asked, and he looked at it and then at her, and something shifted in his expression that was professional respect landing and being registered. "You kept records," he said. "From the beginning," she said. "Of the gold and of the debt situation with Grimes." Adler looked at the gold ledger. He looked at it carefully and for a long time. "This deposit, you're confident of these numbers?" "I'm confident of those numbers," Clara said. "I may be conservative on the lower end. I didn't want to overstate." Adler looked at Ethan. "She doesn't overstate," Ethan said. Adler looked back at Clara. "If this survey comes back consistent with what you've recorded here, you're looking at a significant claim." He folded his hands on the desk. "We need to file today, not tomorrow. The land office closes at 4, and I want this in before the end of business." He paused. "Has anyone else been up on that land?" "Grimes," Ethan said. "He doesn't know about the gold specifically, but he knows we're here, and he knows we came to Helena. He might figure out why." "Then we move now," Adler said, and stood up. The land office was 6 blocks away, and they covered them fast. Adler with his files, Ethan with the survey map he'd drawn of the creek bed, Clara with her notebook. The clerk at the land office was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked at Clara with mild surprise when she sat down at the table and spread her documents alongside the men's, as if this were something women did every Thursday, which in this office it was not. She looked at him until he looked back at his forms. The filing took an hour. Clara caught 2 errors in the preliminary paperwork. Not Adler's errors, the clerk's quiet transpositions of numbers that would have caused problems later, and corrected them without fuss, and without making the clerk feel small about it, which Ethan noted as a particular skill in its own right. When it was done, Adler shook their hands again in the street outside. "The survey crew can be up there within 3 weeks," he said. "Keep working the deposit, but keep it quiet." He looked at Ethan. "And watch Grimes. The deputy who rode up there with him, Haskell. He's county, not Grimes's personal man, so that's good. But Grimes has been buying influence in this county for 15 years. Don't assume the law is always going to look the way it looked today." Ethan nodded. "One more thing," Adler said. He looked between the two of them in the careful way of a man choosing his words. "For the claim to hold absolutely, in the event of a legal challenge, the strongest filing is one with both signatories in clear legal relationship." He paused. "Your partners, as I understand it. Is that the extent of it?" There was a silence. Ethan did not look at Clara. Clara did not look at Ethan. "That's the extent of it," Ethan said. Adler nodded once. "Then we'll file it as a business partnership. That'll hold. But if the situation were to change..." He left it there and put his hat on. "You know where to find me." He went back up to his office. They stood in the street for a moment. "He's right," Clara said, not looking at Ethan. "About the legal situation." "The partnership filing is solid," Ethan said. "I know." A pause. "I'm just saying he's right." Ethan looked at her. She was looking at the building across the street, her expression carefully arranged. He understood what she was saying, and he understood why she wasn't saying it plainly, and he understood also that this was not the moment for plain speech, not in the middle of a Helena Street, with the gold claim just filed, and Grimes's intentions unclear, and spring still 6 weeks away. "One thing at a time," he said. She looked at him then. "Yes," she said, "one thing at a time." They started back for the mountain the next morning. They were 1 mile outside of Helena, moving through the first long stretch of open road before the tree line, when Ethan saw the riders, 3 of them, coming south on the road, moving with the specific purpose of men who knew where they were going and had been paid to get there. Ethan recognized the one in front after a moment, a man named Cord, who worked odd jobs in the county and had a reputation for the kind of odd jobs that didn't get described precisely when people talked about them. They pulled up when they reached Ethan and Clara. Cord looked at Ethan. "Callahan." Then at Clara. "Ma'am." "Cord," Ethan said. "Heading back up the mountain?" "We are." Cord's expression was pleasant in the imprecise way of a man who has been given instructions that leave room for interpretation. "Mr. Grimes has a business proposition for you. Thought it might save some trouble." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "He's willing to buy your claim. Fair price. Lets everybody go their separate ways without further complications." Ethan didn't take the paper. "We don't have a claim to sell." Cord looked at him. "Not officially," Ethan said. "Not until the survey's done." "Right," Cord said. He was quiet for a moment, reassessing. "Mr. Grimes would also be willing to..." "No," Ethan said. Cord looked at him for a long moment. His 2 companions hadn't moved or spoken. The horses shifted in the cold. "Mr. Grimes thought you might say that," Cord said. "Then he wasted your ride," Ethan said. Cord's pleasant expression stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. "He also asked me to remind you that the lady's situation, her legal status, her standing in the county, that can be looked at in different ways, depending on who's asking and who's listening." He paused. "He's got friends in the clerk's office." Clara spoke. She had not said a word since the 3 riders had stopped, and her voice came out now with a precision that cut through the cold air like something very sharp and narrow. "Tell Mr. Grimes that I kept records of everything he told me I owed, everything he paid me, and every instruction he gave me for 4 months. Tell him I've already given a copy of those records to a lawyer in Helena." She paused. "And tell him that if anyone in any clerk's office attempts to interfere with our properly filed claim, those records go to the county commissioner and then to the newspaper in Helena. I believe the Helena Weekly Herald runs on Thursdays. Cord looked at her. He looked at her the way men look at women when they have significantly underestimated them and are in the process of adjusting. "Ma'am," he said finally. "Good day," Clara said. They rode past. Ethan waited until they were 50 yards down the road before he let himself exhale. Then he started walking again, leading the horse, and Clara rode beside him, and for a full minute neither of them said anything. Then Ethan said, You gave Adler a copy of the records. This morning, before we left, she said, while you were seeing to the horses. He was quiet for another moment. Clara. Yes. I need to ask you something. All right. He kept his eyes on the road. Were you planning ahead for both of us? Same way you accused me of doing? A pause. Then, very quietly, almost to herself. Yes, I suppose I was. He nodded once. They walked on. He did not say what was moving through him in that moment, which was the specific and profound and slightly frightening recognition that at some point between November and now, without either of them calling attention to it, they had stopped being two individuals sharing a situation and had become something that thought and planned and moved as a unit. That when she had walked into Adler's office with her notebook and corrected the clerk's errors and looked the hotel keeper into submission, she had been thinking about both of them, the same way he had been thinking about both of them when he sent the Rogers boy to Helena 2 weeks earlier. You didn't do that for an arrangement. You did that for something else. Something that didn't have a clean name yet, but that both of them were circling, carefully, the way you circle a fire when you're cold and you're not sure yet how close it's safe to stand. 3 weeks later, the survey crew came. 4 men, professional and efficient, who spent 2 days on the creek bed with their equipment and their measurements. And when they were done, they sat at Ethan's table and laid out their findings with the flat precision of men reporting facts rather than opinions. The deposit was real, more than real. The survey revealed the creek vein ran deeper than Clara's surface readings had indicated, and extended further east along the bank than either of them had worked. The formal assessment put the claim in the upper category of working deposits in the region, not the largest they'd surveyed that year, but significant, consistently significant. Ethan sat with the papers in front of him after the crew left and read the numbers twice. Clara sat across from him and watched his face. Say something, she said. I don't know what to say, he said. Then I'll say it, she said. We need to move faster. Grimes knows we filed. He's going to try something legal if he can, and something else if he can't. We need to get as much out of the ground as possible before... She stopped. The sound outside was wrong. They both heard it at the same moment. A specific quality of noise that was not wind, and not an animal, and not the natural sound of the mountain doing what it did. Ethan was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand, moving to the wall where his rifle hung, and Clara was already at the window on the other side, looking out with her body to one side of the frame, not directly in front of the glass. 3 men, she said, quiet and level. Coming up the far side of the creek, Ethan checked his rifle. Can you see who? Not Grimes, she said. I don't know the faces. Go to the loft, he said. She turned to look at him. Clara. Give me the knife, she said. He looked at her. She held out her hand and her face was completely steady. No fear in it. Just the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had decided that what happened next was not going to happen to her. It was going to happen with her, which was a different thing entirely. He handed her the knife. She went to the loft, not to hide, he understood, but to have the high ground. He went to the door. What happened next was fast and ugly, and finished in under 2 minutes. The 3 men were not Grimes's regular associates. They were hired men, the kind you found at the edges of mining country, and they came to the cabin with the specific intention of making a statement about what happened to people who didn't accept reasonable business propositions. They didn't expect the man who opened the door to move as fast as Ethan Callahan moved, because most people didn't move that fast, and they didn't expect the woman in the loft to be where she was, or to be what she was, It ended with two men running back down the mountain the way they came, and one man sitting in the snow outside the cabin holding his shoulder, which was not broken but would remind him of this day for a considerable time. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched him go when he finally dragged himself upright, and then went back inside and closed the door. Clara came down from the loft. She still had the knife. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were both breathing harder than they had been 10 minutes ago, and the room felt different, sharper somehow, the way a room feels after something has happened in it that can't be undone. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked at his arm. A cut, not deep, from a knife he'd gotten out of the way of quickly enough. "It's nothing." "Sit down," she said. "Clara, sit down." He sat. She found the cloth she kept for this purpose, and the small bottle of spirits she'd put by against exactly this kind of eventuality, and she cleaned the cut with a focus and steadiness that told him she had done this before, and her hands on his arm were efficient and impersonal until they weren't, until she was done cleaning the wound and wrapping it, and she didn't immediately take her hands away, and he didn't immediately move his arm. They stayed like that for a moment, her hands on his arm very still. Then she lifted her eyes to his face and looked at him from a distance of about 8 inches, which was the closest they had been to each other in 4 months of living in the same cabin, and whatever both of them had been carefully not saying for weeks was present in that 8 inches of space in a way that was impossible to mistake. He said her name, just that, just Clara, and she said, "I know." And then she stood up and put the cloth away and went to the stove, and he sat at the table looking at the bandage on his arm and understanding that something had shifted permanently in the last 30 seconds. The way the earth shifts in a place where the underground pressure has finally been too much for the surface above it. Not a disaster, not a collapse, just the mountain finally showing what it had been holding all along. Outside, the spring thaw was 6 weeks away, and the creek ran dark and gold-threaded under the ice, and in Harrow Creek, Walter Grimes sat behind his counter and counted his options, and found that they were fewer than they had been that morning, and that the woman he had kept in his back room for 4 months was turning out to be considerably more expensive to underestimate than he had originally calculated. He poured a whiskey. He thought about what move was left, and he thought about the one thing Ethan Callahan would not be able to stop with a rifle and 2 fast hands: the law. Grimes moved faster than either of them expected. 3 days after the hired men came up the mountain and left with less dignity than they'd arrived with, a rider came from Harrow Creek with a folded paper that had an official seal on it. Ethan opened it at the table while Clara stood beside him and read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment after they finished. Then Clara said, very quietly, "He filed a fraudulent deed." The paper claimed that Walter Grimes held a prior land interest in the creek property, a deed dated 14 months earlier, before Ethan had even begun working the area seriously, before Clara had ever set foot in Montana. The signature at the bottom of the reference document was not one Ethan recognized. The notary stamp was from a town 60 miles east. "It's a forgery," Ethan said. "Of course it's a forgery," Clara said. "The question is whether it's a good enough forgery to cause us problems before we can prove it isn't real." Ethan set the paper down on the table. His jaw was tight. "Adler needs to see this today." "Yes," Clara said. "But there's something else." She pointed to the second paragraph. "He's not just challenging the claim. He's filing a separate petition. He's claiming that my time at the trading post constituted a labor contract, and that by leaving without completing the contract, I created a legal liability." She paused. "He's trying to use the debt situation as leverage against the claim." Ethan looked at her. "If he can tie the 2 cases together in front of a sympathetic judge," she said, "he creates enough legal confusion to freeze our claim while his deed gets examined. And while the claim is frozen, he works the deposit," Ethan said. "Or he makes it financially painful enough that we sell," Clara said. "Either way, he gets what he wants." Ethan stood up from the table. He was not a man who paced, but he came close to it now, moving to the window and back. "How long do we have?" Clara looked at the paper again. "The petition is scheduled for hearing in 12 days, in Harrow Creek." "Harrow Creek," Ethan said flatly. His town, his judge, almost certainly his judge, Clara said. She folded the paper with precise, careful movements, the way she handled everything that mattered. We need Adler, and we need to find out who that judge is, and whether there's any way to move the hearing to a different venue. She looked at Ethan. And we need to go through every record I have and build something solid enough that no local judge can ignore it without it being obvious what he's doing. He looked at her. She was already moving toward the shelf where she kept her notebooks, pulling them down, opening them with the focused efficiency of someone who has been preparing for exactly this contingency without knowing exactly when it would arrive. "You've been ready for this," he said. She looked up. "I've been ready for something like this since the first week at the trading post," she said. "When you don't have physical power, Ethan, you keep records. That's all you can do." She opened a notebook to a page near the middle. "Fortunately, I'm very good at keeping records." They left for Helena the next morning before the sun was up. Adler read the fraudulent deed twice, slowly, and then set it on his desk and folded his hands over it and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Ethan knew that look. It was the look of a man organizing a complex problem into its component parts. "The deed is a forgery," Adler said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ethan said. "And you can prove it?" "I can prove I've been on that land for 7 years," Ethan said. "Hunting records, trap lines, the cabin itself, the survey crew who came 3 weeks ago." "The survey crew's report," Adler said. He reached into his files and produced it. "Filed with the land office simultaneously with your claim. Good." He looked at Clara. "And the labor contract argument?" Clara opened her notebook and laid it flat on his desk, and then laid the second notebook beside it, and then produced from inside her coat a third document. A letter, handwritten, in a careful script that was not her own. "That's a letter from the undertaker in Harrow Creek," she said. "Confirming Henry's burial expenses. The actual amount, dated and signed." Adler looked at it. "How did you get this?" "I wrote to him in January," Clara said. "I explained the situation. He was not pleased to learn his business was being used as part of a false debt claim." She paused. "He's willing to testify if needed." Adler looked at her over the top of the letter. "Mrs. Whitmore, how many letters did you write this winter?" 11, she said. "To anyone who might have documentation of actual costs during my time in Harrow Creek." The undertaker responded. So did the dry goods supplier who Henry had a legitimate account with, separate from Grimes. And the doctor who saw Henry in his last week. The doctor's letter confirms the medical costs, which were significantly less than what Grimes claimed. Adler sat back in his chair. He looked at Clara for a long moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating something important. "The hearing is in Harrow Creek," Ethan said. "In 12 days. "I know the judge there," Adler said. "Thorne. He's not in Grimes's pocket exactly, but he's comfortable. He doesn't like complicated cases, and he tends to rule in favor of established men." He tapped the desk. "We need to move the hearing." "Can we?" Clara asked. "On grounds of conflict of interest. Grimes has a financial relationship with the county seat that we can document. We have an argument for venue change." Adler looked between them. "But it'll take time, and if the motion is denied, we go to Harrow Creek." "Then we file the motion today," Ethan said. "We file the motion today," Adler agreed. They were in Adler's office for 4 hours. Clara sat at the side table and worked through her notebooks while Adler and Ethan talked through the legal strategy, and periodically she would look up and say something precise and relevant, and Adler would stop and write it down. And after the third time this happened, Adler simply pulled a chair beside her and moved his notepad there, and stopped pretending the most useful person in the room was anywhere other than where she was sitting. At one point, Ethan leaned in the doorway between the two workspaces and watched Clara explain the interest calculations to Adler using her notebook, walking him through the numbers with the patience of a woman who had explained numbers to people her whole life and knew exactly when to slow down and when to move. And Adler was nodding and writing, and Clara was precise and calm and completely in command of the material. And Ethan felt something move through him that was more than pride and more than admiration. Something that was closer to the feeling of watching a person be entirely and completely themselves, fully capable, fully present, not diminished or modified for anyone's comfort. He looked away before she caught him watching. The venue motion was filed by 4 o'clock. Adler said he would have an answer within a week. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon, not talking much, both of them carrying the specific weight of a situation in motion, of pieces moving on a board they didn't fully control. The mountain received them the way it always did, with cold and silence, and the specific indifference of a place that has been there longer than any human trouble and expects to be there long after. They had supper, and Clara wrote in her notebook, and Ethan cleaned his rifle, and at some point, the fire burned down, and neither of them moved to rebuild it. And the room got slightly darker and slightly colder, and neither of them addressed it. "Ethan," Clara said. He looked up from the rifle. "If we lose the hearing," she said, "if Grimes wins the legal argument, what happens?" He set down the rifle. "We appeal." Adler said, "I know what Adler said. I'm asking what you think." Howe was quiet for a moment. "I think Grimes is not going to win," he said. "Not with what you've got in those notebooks." "But if he does," she pressed. He looked at her. Her face was serious and still, the face she wore when she was being completely honest and wanted complete honesty in return. He had come to know that face very well. "If he does," Ethan said, "we keep the cabin. The land claim is one thing. This land—" He stopped. "I built this cabin, Clara. I've lived on this mountain 7 years. He can challenge the creek deposit all he wants. He can't take the ground under the cabin." "And the gold?" He met her eyes. "We take what we've already got. It's significant. Adler's holding it in the bank." He paused. "You'd have enough. Whatever you wanted to do." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not asking about me," she said. "I'm asking about us." The word sat between them. Us. She had said it without hesitation, without the careful management she usually applied to anything that came near that territory. She had said it the way you say a word you've been using in your own head for a while and have finally stopped being careful about. Ethan said, "Then if we lose, we stay. We rebuild. The mountain's not going anywhere, and neither am I." He held her gaze. "And I reckon neither are you." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and looked back at her notebook, but she wasn't writing anything. She was just sitting with her pencil in her hand, looking at the page. "No," she said quietly. "I reckon I'm not." The venue motion was denied. Adler sent word 4 days before the hearing. Judge Thorne had declined to recuse himself and the hearing would proceed in Harrow Creek as scheduled. The messenger also brought a second piece of information, that Grimes had engaged a lawyer from Billings, a man named Farnsworth, who had a reputation for winning cases in front of small county judges in ways that didn't always bear examination. Ethan read the message at the table and handed it to Clara without a word. She read it. Her expression didn't change much. "Farnsworth," she said. "I know that name." "How?" "Howe was involved in a land dispute 2 counties east, 3 years ago. He won." She paused. "The man who lost was a homesteader who'd been on his land for 12 years. The claim against him was supported by a deed that was later proven false. But by the time it was proven, Farnsworth had his client's interest established well enough that the homesteader only got a fraction of what was his." She set the message down. "He's very good at what he does." "Which is what exactly?" "Slowing things down," she said. "Muddying the water. Making what's true look uncertain until the other side either runs out of money or runs out of patience." She looked at Ethan. "He's betting we're going to fold." "We're not going to fold," Ethan said. "I know that," she said. "But we need to walk into that hearing with something clean enough that Farnsworth can't muddy it." She tapped the notebook. "We need someone in that courtroom who can look at my records and confirm them as legitimate. Someone with standing." "The undertaker," Ethan said. "He'll come," Clara said. "He wrote that he would." She paused. "And I'd like to ask the doctor too. Dr. Merritt, from Harrow Creek. He saw Henry in his last week. He knows what Henry's actual medical debts were." She hesitated. "I wrote to him, but he hasn't replied." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I know Merritt," he said. "I'll go to him." She looked at him. "When?" "Tomorrow," he said. "It'll take a day-round trip." He paused. "Will you be all right here?" Her chin came up slightly. "I've been all right here most mornings while you check traps," she said. He almost smiled. "That's true." He stood up and reached for his coat. "I'll be back by dark." She stood too, and for a moment they were both standing in the small space of the cabin, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her arm without fully extending it. And she was looking at him with the direct assessment that he had stopped flinching from weeks ago, because he had come to understand that it was not judgment, it was just her way of being fully present with a person, of actually seeing them, rather than just looking at them. "Be careful," she said. It was 2 words. Simple. Ordinary. It hit him somewhere beneath the sternum, the way simple things do when they carry more weight than their size suggests. "Always am," he said, and went out. Dr. Merritt was a small, weathered man who had been practicing medicine in Harrow Creek for 20 years, and who had, over those 20 years, developed the particular mix of compassion and bluntness that good frontier doctors tended to develop. Because if you were delicate about hard truths in a place like this, people died of your delicacy. He received Ethan in his office behind the general store and listened to the situation without interrupting. When Ethan was done, Merritt said, "Grimes told me the medical account was settled directly with the estate." Ethan looked at him. "There was no estate," Merritt said, his voice going flat and cold. "The man had nothing. I knew that. I wrote off the account as a charity case." He sat forward. "Are you telling me Grimes is claiming I was paid?" "He's claiming the total of Henry Whitmore's debts, including medical, was considerably more than it was," Ethan said, "as part of a fraudulent debt against Mrs. Whitmore." Merritt's expression went through several stages of something that ended at quiet fury. "I'll be at the hearing," he said. "You tell me when and where and I'll be there." "Harrow Creek, 3 days. I know the courthouse." Merritt stood and extended his hand. "And Callahan, you tell that woman she doesn't owe Walter Grimes 1 cent. She never did." Ethan shook his hand. "She knows," he said. "She's known for a while. But it'll mean something, coming from you in front of a judge." The morning of the hearing was clear and bright and cold. The kind of Montana late winter morning that is beautiful the way a knife is beautiful. Clean and hard, and not particularly concerned with your feelings about it. Ethan and Clara rode down from the mountain together, and Adler met them at the edge of Harrow Creek with his files and the focused energy of a man who had spent the last week building something he intended to defend. The undertaker, a man named Boyle, was already at the courthouse steps, standing with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he had been thinking about Walter Grimes and a falsified debt for several weeks and was looking forward to saying what he had to say. Dr. Merritt arrived 5 minutes after they did. Clara looked at the 2 men who had come, and Ethan watched her face do something very careful and private, and then reset itself into the composed expression she kept in place in public. She thanked them both briefly and practically, not making it sentimental, because sentiment would have felt condescending, and she had the intelligence to know it. The courthouse was small and overheated and smelled like old wood and tobacco. The gallery was nearly full. Harrow Creek was a small place, and a legal dispute over a gold claim and a widow was the most interesting thing that had happened in months. Ethan recognized faces from the trading post, from the surrounding ranches, people he had passed on the road over the years. They watched him and Clara come in with the frank curiosity of an audience that had already formed opinions and was here to see whether those opinions would be confirmed. Grimes was already seated at the plaintiff's table with Farnsworth beside him. Farnsworth was a tall man, well-dressed in the way that was meant to be noticed, with a leather case on the table in front of him and the comfortable posture of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. He looked at Clara when she came in, and his expression was politely professional, which was more insulting than hostility would have been. Grimes looked at her too. His look was different. It was the look of a man who has laid a trap and is watching the thing he trapped walk into the room. Clara sat down and opened her notebook and did not look at Grimes at all. Judge Thorne came in, and the room stood and sat, and it started. Farnsworth was exactly as good as his reputation. He opened with the deed, presenting it with confident fluency, establishing the timeline, referring to the notarization, speaking about prior land interest with the easy authority of a man presenting facts rather than arguments. He made it sound self-evident. He made it sound like the kind of thing that was so obviously true that contesting it was almost poor taste. Then he moved to the labor contract argument, and here he was even smoother, speaking about the widow's situation with something that almost resembled sympathy, framing the story of her time at the trading post as a voluntary arrangement, a mutually beneficial agreement disrupted by outside interference. He made Ethan sound like the aggressor. He made Clara sound like a woman who had been confused about the nature of the arrangement she'd entered into. Ethan kept his face still. Adler leaned over and murmured, "Don't react." "I know," Ethan murmured back. He looked at Clara. She was writing in her notebook with a small, precise script, not looking at Farnsworth, not looking at the judge, just writing. He couldn't tell what she was writing. He wasn't sure it mattered. It was something to do with her hands while she waited, something to keep the composure she was maintaining at considerable cost. Then Adler stood up. He started with the deed. He presented the survey crew's report, filed at the land office before Grimes's fraudulent deed had been submitted. He produced 3 witnesses who could testify to Ethan's continuous presence on the land for 7 years. He presented the timeline with the calm precision of a man who has built something solid and wants the room to understand exactly how solid it is. Then he called Ethan. Ethan answered Adler's questions directly and briefly. He did not elaborate, and he did not editorialize, and he looked at the judge, not at Grimes, because Grimes was not the person he needed to persuade. Farnsworth cross-examined with polished aggression, trying to find the gaps in the timeline, trying to suggest that 7 years of solitary mountain living left a lot of space for other men to have had interests in the land that Ethan might have been unaware of. He was skilled. He landed a few points that made the gallery murmur. Then Adler called Clara. She walked to the stand with her notebooks under her arm, and she sat down, and she looked at Judge Thorne directly, and she did not look at Grimes. Adler took her through the notebooks, page by page, column by column. She explained her methodology with the clarity of a woman who had been explaining figures to people her whole life, and who understood that clarity was its own form of authority. She explained how she had kept the record from the 3rd week at the trading post. She explained why. She explained what the numbers showed. Farnsworth objected twice. Thorne overruled him both times. Then Adler called Boyle, the undertaker. Boyle stated the actual burial costs with the flat certainty of a man reading from his own ledger, which he had brought. The number was a fraction of what Grimes had claimed. Then Adler called Dr. Merritt. Merritt took the stand and stated clearly that he had never been paid for Henry Whitmore's medical care, that he had written the account off as a charity case, and that he had certainly never authorized anyone to claim those costs as part of a debt owed by Henry's widow. The gallery was very quiet. Farnsworth conferred with Grimes in a rapid, low-voiced exchange that Ethan could not hear, but could read by the set of both men's shoulders. Things had shifted. The comfortable authority Farnsworth had built in his opening was no longer standing on the same ground. Thorne called a recess. Ethan and Clara and Adler sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, and the undertaker shook Clara's hand, and Dr. Merritt patted her arm with the slightly awkward warmth of a man who is not comfortable with sentiment, but is feeling it regardless. And then both men went to find coffee. Adler said, "The deed is the question. The labor contract argument is collapsing on its own. The deed." He paused. "Thorne has to decide whether to validate it or call for further examination." "The notary stamp," Clara said. "Did you find anything on the notary?" Adler allowed himself a very small smile. "The notary died 11 months ago," he said. "The stamp was used after his death." The silence in the hallway lasted about 3 seconds. Then Clara said, "You've had that since when?" 4 days, Adler said. "I didn't want to tell you until I was certain. A clerk in the county east confirmed it yesterday morning." Ethan looked at him. "Why didn't you open with it?" "Because I wanted Farnsworth to build his entire case on the deed before I took the foundation out," Adler said simply. "It's more complete that way. More final." Clara looked at Adler with an expression that was as close to genuine admiration as she usually allowed herself in public. "You're very good at this," she said. "So are you," Adler said, and meant it. When court resumed, Adler presented the notary evidence. He did it without drama. He simply stood up and stated the fact that the notary whose stamp appeared on the deed in question had died 11 months prior to the deed's purported execution date, and submitted the death record from the county, certified by the clerk. The room went very still. Grimes moved in his chair. Farnsworth went absolutely motionless. Judge Thorne looked at the death record. He looked at the deed. He looked at Farnsworth. Farnsworth stood up. "Your Honor, if we could have a brief—" "Sit down, Mr. Farnsworth," Thorne said. Farnsworth sat down. What followed was methodical and quiet, the way consequential things often are, without the drama that the situation seemed to demand. Thorne examined both documents. He asked 3 questions of Adler, 2 of which Clara answered by reference to her notebook. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he ruled. The deed was invalid. The labor contract claim was dismissed on the evidence of actual costs as presented by both witnesses. Ethan's land claim stood. The gold deposit was legally theirs. Grimes was on his feet before Thorne finished speaking. "Your Honor, there are avenues of appeal. This isn't—" "Mr. Grimes," Thorne said, in a voice that had gone from comfortable to cold, "you have presented a document bearing a dead man's stamp as evidence in my court. I strongly recommend that whatever you plan to do next, you do it with a great deal of counsel and a great deal of care." He looked at him for a moment. "And I would suggest that the county prosecutor may want to speak with you before long." The gallery erupted. Ethan sat very still. He heard the noise around him. The voices, the scraping of chairs, Adler gathering his papers with the satisfied movements of a man who has done what he set out to do. And he heard Grimes's voice somewhere behind him, raised and furious, and Farnsworth's low, urgent response. And he heard all of it from a slight distance, because what was immediately in front of him was Clara. She was still sitting beside him. She had closed her notebook. She had her hands flat on the cover of it, very still. Her face was turned slightly away from him, toward the window, and in the particular angle of the light coming through the glass, he could see that her jaw was set with enormous precision, the precision of a person who has been holding something in for a long time and is now deciding whether it is safe, finally, to let it go. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the notebook. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Not wet. Clara was not a woman who cried easily or publicly, but bright with the specific intensity of a person who has just had something given back to them that was taken a long time ago, something more than a legal ruling, something that went further back than Harrow Creek and the Trading Post and even Walter Grimes entirely. "It's over," he said. She held his gaze. "It's over," she agreed. He didn't take his hand away, and she didn't move hers. They stayed like that for a moment, in the middle of the room, while everything moved around them. And then Adler appeared at Ethan's shoulder with his coat and his files, and his carefully restrained expression of professional satisfaction, and they stood up and went toward the door. Outside, the air was cold and clean, and the sky above Harrow Creek was the particular blue that appears in Montana in late February, when the light is starting to mean something again, when the angle of it has shifted just enough to carry the first suggestion of what's coming. Grimes was somewhere behind them. He would deal with what was coming to him. The law would see to that. What was in front of Ethan Callahan, standing in the clear, cold air outside a courthouse in a town he had always avoided, with a woman beside him who had just used a pencil and a notebook and 11 letters and the truth to dismantle a man who had believed she was powerless. What was in front of him felt like something he hadn't had a name for in a very long time. Something that was not quite what it would be in another week or another month. But that was already, unmistakably, beginning. Clara pulled her coat around her and looked north, in the direction of the mountain. She could not see it from here, but she knew where it was. She had known for a while exactly where it was, the same way you know the direction of a place you have already, without quite deciding to, started thinking of as home. "Let's go back," she said. Ethan looked at her. "To the cabin," she said, and there it was. Not to Denver. Not to wherever spring would allow her to go. Not to any of the places the agreement had left open for her since November. To the cabin. He reached down and took her hand, the way he had put his hand over hers in the courtroom, not asking for permission, not making it into a speech, just the direct, honest action of a man who had something true to say and was saying it the only way he currently had words for. She looked at their hands. Then she looked at him. She didn't pull away. "All right then," he said. And they walked to the horses, and the mountain waited for them the way it always had, cold and permanent and entirely indifferent to human troubles, except that nothing about going back up it now felt the same as it had when they'd come down. Nothing about any of it was going to feel the same again. They rode back up the mountain in the last of the afternoon light, and neither of them tried to fill the silence with words that weren't ready yet. That was one of the things Ethan had learned about Clara over the course of the winter. She did not use language as a placeholder. She did not speak to fill space or to manage the discomfort of quiet. When she was ready to say something, she said it with the full weight of having thought it through. And when she wasn't ready, she waited. And the waiting was not avoidance, but preparation. He had come to trust that quality in her more than almost anything else. He was not ready either. What had happened in that courtroom? The ruling, the look on Grimes's face, the moment with their hands on the notebook, was still settling in him the way the earth settles after a significant shift, everything finding its new level. He needed the mountain for that. He needed the cold and the familiar trail and the specific quality of silence that existed above 4,000 feet, where the only sounds were the ones that belonged there. They reached the cabin as the last light was going. Ethan saw to the horse, and Clara started the fire, and when he came in from outside, the cabin was already warming, and she had the coffee on, and there was something on the stove that smelled like the venison stew, the real one, the one he had first tasted at the trading post back in November, the one that had started all of this. He stopped in the doorway. "I had what I needed," she said, without turning around. Finally. He hung up his coat on the second hook from the right. She had left it free. He sat down at the table, and she brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the firelight, the way people look at each other when they have been through something together and are only now beginning to understand what it added up to. "Grimes won't be coming back," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "Thorne will send word to the prosecutor. Adler will make sure of it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "It's done. It's done," he said. The fire cracked. Outside, the mountain was settling into its night sounds, the particular creaks and sighs of a cold place that has held its temperature all day and is now exhaling. Ethan knew every sound of it. He had listened to it alone for 7 years. It sounded different now, with her in it. I didn't know when that had changed. He couldn't point to a day or a moment, not exactly. It had happened the way most true things happened, not in a single decisive instant, but in the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that each meant something individually and together meant something else, something larger and more permanent. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "What you did today," he said, "in that courtroom, with those notebooks." He stopped. He was not a man who spoke easily about things that mattered, and this was a thing that mattered considerably. "That was, I kept records," she said. "Not deflecting, just precise." "You kept records from the 3rd week," he said. "When you were in the back room of a trading post with nothing and nowhere to go. You kept records because you understood that one day it would matter, and you didn't know when that day would be, but you were going to be ready for it." He held her gaze. "That's not just keeping records, Clara. That's a kind of courage I don't have a good word for." She was very still. He had surprised her. He could tell because the careful composure she maintained in moments of significance had shifted slightly, something showing through that she didn't often let through in his presence, something that was not quite vulnerability and not quite emotion, but was the territory between them, the place where a person lives before they decide whether to let someone else in. "My mother kept records," she said finally. "For my father's store." She said the same thing every time she sat down to the ledger. She said, The numbers are the truth, and the truth is the only thing nobody can take from you." She paused. She was right. She was, Ethan said. Clara looked at her coffee. "I thought about her a lot this winter," she said. "Sitting at this table with my notebook. I thought about what she would have said about all of this." A pause. "I think she would have liked the mountain." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I think she would have liked you." She looked up. He met her eyes steadily. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then something in her expression changed. The last careful management of it releasing. The final controlled arrangement giving way, not to distress, not to anything dramatic, but to something quieter and more definitive. The look of a woman who has been standing at a door for a long time and has finally decided to open it. "Ethan," she said, "I need to say something." "All right. When we first came up here," she said, "I told you I wasn't your servant, that I'd work and cook and do my share, but that I wasn't going to ask permission and I wasn't going to take orders." She paused. "And you said you didn't give orders. You made agreements." "I remember," he said. "We made an agreement," she said. "And the agreement was that in spring I could leave. I could go to Denver or Helena or wherever I wanted with my share of what we earned." She looked at him. "It's nearly spring." "It is," he said. "And I'm not going," she said. He didn't say anything. "I want to be clear about that," she said. "Not because I have nowhere to go. I have enough gold to go wherever I want now, and we both know it. Not because I'm afraid of starting over. I've started over before, and I can do it again. I'm not going because this is where I want to be." She set down her coffee cup with a small, precise click. "And I want to say that clearly. I don't want it to be something that was understood between us without being said. I want it said." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I'm glad," he said, "that you want it said." He paused. "I want to say something too." She waited. "I've been alone on this mountain for 7 years," he said. "And I told myself that was a choice. That after Sarah that this was what I wanted. That people were more complicated than the mountain, and the mountain was enough." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table and then back at her. "It wasn't enough. I just couldn't see what was missing because I'd stopped looking." His voice was level, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "You walked out through that curtain in Walter Grimes's trading post, and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth the risk, and I thought, there is someone who understands exactly what the cost of trust is, exactly what it takes to extend it anyway." He paused. "I've been watching you do that all winter. Every day. It's the bravest thing I've ever seen." Clara was looking at him with those dark, direct eyes, and they were very bright, and she was not crying, because she was not a woman who cried easily, but she was somewhere very close to the place where the decision about crying gets made. "Ethan Callahan," she said, and her voice was steady but warm, in a way it had not been in all the months he had known her. Or perhaps it had been, and he was only now letting himself hear it. "Are you trying to tell me something?" "I'm trying to tell you several things," he said, "most of which I don't have adequate words for." "Try," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the careful gesture from the courtroom, the cover and hold of something still being decided. This was direct and deliberate, his hand closing around hers on the table, and he looked at her when he did it the way a person looks at something they have decided is true and are no longer going to argue with. "Stay," he said. "Not because of the claim, not because of the cabin, not because of any arrangement we made in November. Stay, because I would like very much to keep waking up in this cabin and knowing you're here." He paused. "And I would like to renegotiate the terms of our partnership." She looked at their hands, then at him. "What terms were you thinking?" "Permanent ones," he said. The word sat between them. Clara turned her hand under his, so their palms were together, and she held on, and she looked at him for a long time with the full weight of everything she was. The woman who kept records in a back room, who drew sluice measurements in a notebook, who stood in a courthouse and dismantled a corrupt man with arithmetic and the truth, who had walked out into 30 below cold on the word of a man she didn't know, and built something out of the situation she found there. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. That was that. No elaborate speech, no theatrical declaration, because neither of them were theatrical people, and the thing between them was too real for theater. Just two people at a table in a mountain cabin with coffee going cold between them and a fire going warm behind them, holding on. The spring thaw came 3 weeks later, the way it always did in Montana. Not gently, not with any particular ceremony, but as a fact that arrived and began rearranging everything in its path. The creek ran fast and high, the ice breaking up in chunks that moved south with the current. The trail down to Harrow Creek became passable for the first time since November, and then, a week after that, passable for a wagon. Adler sent word that Grimes had been formally charged. Fraud and forgery, the deed, and additionally a separate inquiry into his business practices over the past several years that had attracted the attention of the county prosecutor with what Adler described as satisfying enthusiasm. Haskell, the deputy, had voluntarily provided a statement about the visit he'd made with Grimes to the cabin in February. The statement was not favorable to Grimes. Ethan read the letter at breakfast and handed it to Clara and watched her read it with the expression of a woman receiving information she had already expected and had already accounted for. "He'll take a deal," she said, setting the letter down. "He's not the kind of man who goes to prison if he can help it. He'll give them something in exchange for a reduced charge." "Probably," Ethan said. "It doesn't matter," she said. "He's finished in this county either way." She picked up her coffee. He looked at her across the table. She was wearing her dark dress, the one she'd had since the trading post, though she'd repaired it twice over the winter, and it fit her differently now than it had in November. Or perhaps she wore it differently, carried herself differently, stood in it with a different relationship to the space she occupied. She was not the woman who had stood with her shoulders slightly forward, taking up as little room as possible. She had not been that woman for a while. "I want to talk about something," she said. "All right." "The survey estimate," she said. "Adler thinks we should bring in a partner, someone with capital to properly develop the claim. He has someone in mind, a man from Helena who's done this before, who deals fairly." She looked at him. "I want to meet him first before we agree to anything." "Of course," Ethan said. "And I want it structured so that our controlling interest doesn't change," she said. "Whoever comes in has a share but not a say. The decisions stay with us." "Agreed," he said. She nodded. "I'll write to Adler." She stood and went to the shelf where she kept her notebooks and pulled out the larger one and came back to the table and sat down and opened it. And Ethan sat across from her and drank his coffee and watched her write with the pleasure of a man who has stopped pretending he doesn't want to look. After a while she looked up and caught him watching and did not look away. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She gave him the look she reserved for statements she did not believe, but was going to allow to pass unchallenged. He almost smiled. "I was thinking," he said, "that we should go to Helena, soon. There's someone there I want to see." "Adler?" "After Adler," he said. She looked at him. "The Reverend at the Lutheran Church on 3rd Street, he said. A pause. Clara set her pencil down. She looked at him with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, and he held her gaze without qualification, because there was nothing in what he had just said that required qualification. It was what it was. It was what they both knew it was, had known for weeks without it needing to be said, and now it had been said, and it was in the room, and it was real. "You want to do this properly," she said. "I want to do everything with you properly," he said, "for the rest of whatever time we've got." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote something in her notebook, and when she turned it around to show him, he looked at it and then looked at her, and something happened in his chest that he had no word for and did not need one. She had written, 3rd Street Lutheran. Ask for the Reverend. Below it, permanent terms. He looked at her. She was watching him with those dark eyes that had looked at him from the beginning, as if they were measuring the distance between what he appeared to be and what he actually was, and had, somewhere in the long winter between November and April, determined that the distance was not so great that it couldn't be crossed. "Next week?" she said. "Next week," he said. They went to Helena on a Wednesday, when the road was solid and the sky was clear, and the mountain stood behind them in the blue morning air, like something that had always been there and intended to keep being there, patient and permanent, entirely unimpressed by the particular small human business being conducted in its shadow. Adler met them first, as planned. The meeting with the potential partner, a methodical, fair-dealing man named Hargrove, who looked at Clara's notebooks with the respect of someone who understood immediately what he was looking at, went well. Clara asked 3 questions during the meeting. Each one was precisely the right question, and by the end of the 3rd one, Hargrove had turned slightly to address his answers primarily to her, which was the measure of a man who could read where the real competence in a room was located. The terms were agreed. Controlling interest remained with Ethan and Clara. Hargrove would provide capital for proper equipment and survey expansion. Profits would be divided after costs on an agreed schedule that Clara had written out, and Hargrove and Adler both reviewed and found completely fair and completely airtight. When it was signed, Adler shook both their hands and looked at them with the mild, knowing expression of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where things were decided and could tell when something more than business had been settled. They left his office at noon. They walked to 3rd Street Lutheran. The Reverend was a quiet man named Haas, who had married miners and ranchers and homesteaders and widows and all manner of frontier people in the 18 years he had been in Helena, and who had learned to ask the questions that mattered and not ask the ones that didn't. He looked at Ethan and Clara together and saw what there was to see, which was 2 people who had already made their decision and were here to make it formal. And he moved things along with a pastoral efficiency that they both appreciated. There were no guests. They had not planned for guests. This was not a performance. It was a fact being recorded. Ethan stood in the small room and looked at Clara, who stood beside him in the dark dress she had repaired twice over the winter, with her hair pinned and her hands quiet at her sides, and her eyes on him with the full, clear directness that had been looking at him since the night she walked out through Walter Grimes's curtain and asked him what he wanted. What he wanted was this. He had known it for a while. He suspected she had known it slightly longer than he had, because she was in most things slightly ahead of him in understanding, and he had come to love that about her, with the specific fondness of a man who has spent his whole life being self-sufficient, and has discovered the particular relief of being with someone who does not need him to be the smartest person in the room. Haas asked the questions. Ethan answered them. Clara answered them. It was done. Outside, the Helena street was moving with its ordinary afternoon business. Horses and wagons and people going about their lives in the particular obliviousness of people who don't know that something significant has just happened in the building beside them. The sun was on the street, and the air had the quality of early spring, still cold, but carrying something underneath the cold that was different from February, different from January. A shift in the quality of the air that said the worst was behind you now, and what was coming was not winter. Clara stood on the step and turned her face up to the sun for a moment, eyes closed. Ethan stood beside her and watched. She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Ready?" she said. "Been ready," he said. She took his arm, not leaning on it, not being led, just taking it the way a person takes the arm of someone they have chosen to walk beside. And they went down the steps and into the street and started back toward where the horses were tied. They rode home the next morning, up the mountain, through the pass, along the trail that Ethan knew every step of and that Clara now knew almost as well, having walked it and ridden it through November and January and February and March and into the beginning of April. The aspens were beginning to think about what they were going to do, the branches holding a faint suggestion of bud at the edges. The creek below the trail was running high and fast and copper-colored in the morning light, and if you listened carefully, you could hear the specific sound of it that was different from its winter sound, not ice-muffled and cautious, but open and moving and carrying all the runoff of the mountain down to wherever water went when it left the high country. They came over the last rise and the cabin was below them, low and solid in the hillside, looking exactly the way it always looked, permanent, unimpressed, built for the long term by a man who had understood from the beginning that if he was going to be here, he was going to be here in a serious way. Clara reined in the horse and looked at it. "Still small," she said. "We could add a room," Ethan said. East side has the space for it. She considered it. 2 rooms on the east side, she said. 1 for working, 1 for... She paused, and something moved across her face that was private and warm, and not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. We'll need more space eventually, she said. For various reasons. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing further, because she had said what she meant, and she did not elaborate on what she meant when what she meant was clear. His throat felt tight in the specific way it had been feeling tight since the previous afternoon in the Lutheran church, since the Reverend said what he said, and it became real in the way that official things become real, layered on top of the reality that had already been there for weeks. East side, he said. East side, she agreed. They rode the last stretch down to the cabin, and Ethan saw to the horses, and Clara went inside, and by the time he came in from the small barn, the fire was going, and something was on the stove, and the cabin was warm, and it smelled the way it had been smelling all winter, the way he now understood he had been missing for 7 years without knowing what exactly he was missing. He hung his coat on the second hook. He sat at the table. Clara brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the late afternoon light coming through the window. The same light that came through the same window every late afternoon. The same table, the same 2 chairs, the same fire. And it was entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary in the same moment, which was the nature of the life they had built here. The unglamorous daily specific weight of it. The firewood and the notebooks and the traps and the gold and the coffee and the long mountain silences and the arguments and the hands on the table and all the rest of it. The whole accumulation of ordinary days that turned out to be the point. That was it. That was the whole of it. Not the courtroom, not the gold, not the legal victory or the fraudulent deed or the hired men in the snow. Those were the tests. The point was this. The cabin and the fire and the woman across the table who had walked out of a trading post back room on the word of a stranger and built something out of nothing and chosen, when she had every option, to stay. Ethan, Clara said. Yeah, I'm going to need a better pencil, she said. The stub is almost gone. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived right behind a smile, the warmth beneath the composure, the person behind the careful management. I'll get you a pencil, he said. Good, she said. She opened her notebook. He drank his coffee. Outside, the mountain held its ground the way it always had, cold and ancient and indifferent to human arrangements. But inside the cabin, the fire was going, and 2 people sat at the same table they had been sitting at all winter, and the woman who had no place left to go had found the only place she wanted to be, and the man who had stopped believing that any of it was still possible for him had been proven, decisively and permanently, wrong. He had asked who made the stew. She had walked through the curtain. Everything else was just the story of what happened when 2 people who had each survived the worst decided to stop surviving alone. And in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, on a mountain that asked everything of the people who lived on it, that decision turned out to be the only